My name is Ryan, and this happened to me in September of 2023. I still don't like talking about it because every time someone asks why I refuse to drive through the Mojave Desert anymore, I have to decide whether to tell them the truth or let them think I simply had a bad camping trip. The truth sounds unbelievable. I'm 29 years old, and at the time, I worked as a freelance photographer based in Las Vegas. Most of my jobs involved shooting landscapes, abandoned buildings, or drone footage for travel blogs and outdoor magazines. I spent a lot of time alone, driving through places most people only saw on maps. The Mojave wasn't new to me. I'd driven through parts of it at least a dozen times. I knew the basics. Bring more water than you think you'll need. Fill up whenever you find a gas station. Never depend entirely on your phone for navigation. That trip started because I wanted photos of an abandoned mining camp about 30 miles off a little-used dirt road in Eastern California. A history website had hired me to photograph what was left before the structures collapsed completely. The assignment was supposed to take 1 day. I planned to drive out early Saturday morning, spend a few hours taking pictures, camp overnight if I needed to, and head back to Las Vegas on Sunday. Nothing about the trip felt unusual. Before leaving, I stopped in Baker for gas and bought 6 bottles of water, 2 sports drinks, beef jerky, trail mix, and a bag of ice for my cooler. I checked my spare tire, filled the fuel tank, and downloaded offline maps onto my phone. Everything seemed under control. By 10 that morning, I had left the highway behind. The paved road turned into gravel. The gravel turned into packed dirt. Eventually, even the dirt road looked more like 2 faded tire tracks cutting through miles of dry desert. The scenery barely changed. Endless sand and rock, dry washes, Joshua trees standing alone like they had been forgotten years ago. Every few miles I passed old wooden telephone poles leaning at odd angles. Some had wires hanging loose. Others had no wires left at all. It was quiet enough that I could hear the tires crunching over loose gravel with the windows closed. Around noon, I reached the old mining camp. There wasn't much left. A rusted water tank, half of a collapsed wooden building, pieces of old mining equipment scattered across the ground. The place felt abandoned decades ago. I spent nearly 3 hours there taking photos and flying my drone. The temperature climbed to around 109 degrees. Even standing still for a few minutes made sweat run down my back. I stayed hydrated, drank 2 bottles of water, and figured I still had more than enough for the drive back. Around 3:30, I packed everything into my SUV and started heading toward the highway. About 40 minutes later, I heard a loud pop. The steering wheel jerked hard. I slowed down immediately and climbed out. The rear passenger side tire was completely flat. A jagged piece of volcanic rock had sliced through the sidewall. It wasn't a huge problem. I had a spare. I grabbed the jack and started changing it. The heat made everything harder. Within 20 minutes, I was soaked with sweat. The spare was finally on. I tossed the damaged tire into the cargo area and kept driving. I figured the worst part of my day was over. I was wrong. About an hour later, a warning light appeared on the dashboard. Engine temperature high. I frowned. The gauge climbed steadily toward the red. I pulled over before the engine overheated completely. When I opened the hood, hot air blasted into my face. Coolant had sprayed across part of the engine compartment. I wasn't a mechanic, but I knew enough to realize something had failed. I checked my phone. No service. Not even 1 bar. I climbed onto a nearby hill hoping for a signal. Nothing. just endless desert stretching in every direction. The nearest highway was probably 25 miles away. I stood there for nearly a minute, trying to decide what to do. Walking wasn't an option, not in that heat. The safest place was the SUV. I remembered reading that years ago. If you're stranded in the desert, stay with your vehicle unless you're absolutely certain help is close. So, that's what I did. As the sun slowly dropped lower, the temperature became more bearable. I inventoried my supplies: 3 full bottles of water, 1 sports drink, some snacks, a flashlight, a first aid kit, emergency blanket, portable battery pack. The battery on my phone was still above 90%. I turned it completely off to save power. By sunset, the desert looked completely different. The bright tan ground turned dark gray. Long shadows stretched across the sand. The wind picked up, carrying fine dust against the SUV. I climbed into the driver's seat and cracked the windows slightly. It was surprisingly cold once the sun disappeared. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket and tried to sleep. That didn't last long. Around 9 o'clock, I heard something outside. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It sounded like footsteps moving through gravel. Slow, heavy. They stopped near the passenger side. I held my breath. Maybe a coyote, maybe another animal. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. The footsteps continued. They circled around the back of the SUV. Then everything went quiet. I waited. Nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it had probably been an animal attracted by the smell of food. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. The first thing I noticed was how dry my mouth felt. I took a few careful sips from one of the bottles. I knew I couldn't waste water. The second thing I noticed made me stop moving. There were footprints outside my driver's door. Human footprints. I unlocked the door and stepped out. The prints came from somewhere beyond a nearby hill. They circled my SUV once, then disappeared back the same way. I looked around. No vehicles, no tents, no buildings, nothing. The footprints looked fresh. The edges hadn't been softened by the wind yet. Someone had walked around my SUV while I was asleep. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe another stranded traveler. Maybe someone checking to see if I needed help. But if that were true, why hadn't they knocked? Why hadn't they said anything? I climbed the nearest ridge and scanned the desert. For several minutes, I saw absolutely nothing. Then, far away, nearly a mile across the open desert, I spotted someone standing on top of another ridge. The person wasn't moving. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. They just stood there, facing my direction, watching. I raised my camera with the telephoto lens. The autofocus searched for the figure. Just before the image became sharp, the person stepped backward and disappeared behind the ridge. I waited. They never came back. I told myself they had simply walked away. Still, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't worried about the broken SUV anymore. I was worried about whoever had been close enough to walk around it while I slept, and why they chose to watch me from a distance instead of offering help. It was surprisingly cold once the sun disappeared. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket and tried to sleep. That didn't last long. Around 9 o'clock, I heard something outside. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It sounded like footsteps moving through gravel. Slow, heavy. They stopped near the passenger side. I held my breath. Maybe a coyote, maybe another animal. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. The footsteps continued. They circled around the back of the SUV. Then everything went quiet. I waited. Nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it had probably been an animal attracted by the smell of food. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise. The first thing I noticed was how dry my mouth felt. I took a few careful sips from one of the bottles. I knew I couldn't waste water. The second thing I noticed made me stop moving. There were footprints outside my driver's door, human footprints. I unlocked the door and stepped out. The prints came from somewhere beyond a nearby hill. They circled my SUV once, then disappeared back the same way. I looked around. No vehicles, no tents, no buildings, nothing. The footprints looked fresh. The edges hadn't been softened by the wind yet. Someone had walked around my SUV while I was asleep. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe another stranded traveler. Maybe someone checking to see if I needed help. But if that were true, why hadn't they knocked? Why hadn't they said anything? I climbed the nearest ridge and scanned the desert. For several minutes, I saw absolutely nothing. Then, far away, nearly a mile across the open desert, I spotted someone standing on top of another ridge. The person wasn't moving. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. They just stood there, facing my direction, watching. I raised my camera with the telephoto lens. The autofocus searched for the figure, just before the image became sharp. The person stepped backward and disappeared behind the ridge. I waited. They never came back. I told myself they had simply walked away. Still, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't worried about the broken SUV anymore. I was worried about whoever had been close enough to walk around it while I slept, and why they chose to watch me from a distance instead of offering help. The memory card I'd used that morning was missing. I searched every camera pocket, every zipper, every storage case. Nothing. I clearly remembered putting it inside the camera bag after leaving the mining camp. I even emptied the backpack onto the passenger seat. No card. I assumed I'd dropped it while changing the tire. It was frustrating, but it wasn't the biggest problem anymore. Around 3 in the afternoon, I saw movement. The same ridge, the same place. The figure was back, standing perfectly still. This time, I didn't grab my camera. Instead, I waved both arms. "Hey!" No response. I shouted again. Nothing. The person remained motionless. After almost 30 seconds, they slowly turned and disappeared behind the hill again. I seriously considered walking after them. Then I looked at the blazing sun overhead. If they were a mile away, I'd probably lose more water than I could afford. I stayed where I was. As evening approached, the heat finally eased. The desert slowly came alive. A jackrabbit darted across the road. Somewhere in the distance, I heard coyotes calling to each other. A raven landed on a dead Joshua tree before flying away again. Everything felt strangely peaceful for a little while. Just after sunset, I opened the cooler. The ice had completely melted. The water inside was warm. I took another small drink and closed the lid. I was down to less than 2 bottles. Night arrived quickly. The stars filled the sky. Without city lights, the Milky Way stretched from one end of the horizon to the other. Normally, I would have taken dozens of long exposure photographs. Instead, I kept looking into the darkness beyond the headlights of my SUV, waiting. Around 10 o'clock, I heard footsteps again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Exactly like the night before. Slow, deliberate. This time they came from behind the SUV. I grabbed my flashlight. The footsteps stopped. I switched the light on and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing. Only rocks, sand, small desert shrubs. I slowly walked around the vehicle. The beam reached maybe 50 feet into the darkness. Beyond that, everything disappeared into blackness. I completed one full circle. No one. Then I noticed something on the hood. A plastic bottle. I froze. It hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. I stepped closer. It was a sealed bottle of water. Cold. Not cool. Actually cold. Tiny drops of condensation covered the plastic. I picked it up. The label looked brand new. No dust. No scratches. Someone had placed it there while I was searching the other side of the SUV. That realization made every hair on my arm stand up. I quickly shined my flashlight across the open desert. I stood in the middle of the road, staring at the second bottle. The words were impossible to ignore. "You're going the wrong way." I looked behind me. My SUV hadn't moved an inch since the engine overheated. There was only one dirt road cutting through the desert, and I had stayed with my vehicle exactly like every survival guide tells you to do. So, what did the message mean? I picked up the bottle. Just like the first one, it was ice cold. The plastic was covered in tiny drops of condensation, even though the desert was already heating up. I looked around again. Nothing. The figure was gone. I walked back to the SUV with the bottle in one hand and my flashlight in the other, even though the sun was fully up. By noon, I had a decision to make. I only had one bottle of my own water left. The mysterious bottles might save my life, or they might kill me. I stared at the unopened seal for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, I twisted the cap. It cracked open exactly like a brand new bottle. I smelled the water, nothing unusual. I took one small sip. It tasted perfectly normal, cool, clean, no strange smell, no strange taste. I waited, 5 minutes, 10, nothing happened. For the first time in 2 days, I actually felt relieved. Whoever was leaving the bottles clearly wanted me alive. That thought should have comforted me. Instead, it terrified me, because it meant someone had been close enough to watch me the entire time, without me ever seeing them. That afternoon, the heat became unbearable again. The temperature had to be over 110 degrees. The horizon shimmered with waves of hot air. Buzzards circled high above me. Every few minutes, I caught myself staring at them. I knew what they were waiting for. Around 3 o'clock, I heard another engine. This one was louder. I climbed onto the roof of the SUV and waved my emergency blanket. The sound came closer, closer, then faded away. I couldn't believe it. It felt like the desert itself was playing tricks on me. As evening approached, the wind picked up. A wall of dust appeared on the horizon. Within minutes, a sandstorm swept across the valley. I climbed inside the SUV and shut every window. The wind slammed against the doors. Fine sand forced its way through tiny gaps around the seals. The storm lasted nearly an hour. When it finally ended, the entire landscape had changed. The road was barely visible. Most of the tire tracks had disappeared beneath fresh sand. Even the footprints around my SUV were gone, except one, a single set of fresh boot prints. They started at my driver's door. They walked 50 feet into the desert. Then, they simply stopped. There were no return tracks, no drag marks, nothing, just footprints that ended in the middle of open sand. I refused to follow them. Night came quickly. I locked every door before sunset. This time, I didn't wait for the footsteps. I knew they were coming. Around 11, they started. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow circles around the SUV, sometimes near the hood, sometimes behind me, sometimes beside my window. I held my breath and didn't move. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. A shadow passed across the windshield. Someone had walked directly in front of my vehicle. I grabbed the flashlight and switched it on. The beam caught the back of a person walking away. Dark clothes, baseball cap, average height, no backpack, no flashlight, no water, just calmly walking into the darkness. I jumped out of the SUV. "Hey!" The person never looked back. I ran after them. They disappeared behind a rocky hill less than 100 yards away. When I reached it, no one was there. There was nowhere to hide, only open desert. I suddenly realized how far I had run. The SUV was now a small shape in the distance. Panic hit me. The second message echoed in my head. "You're going the wrong way." I turned around and sprinted back. By the time I reached the vehicle, I was exhausted. I had wasted precious energy and water chasing someone who seemed to vanish every time I got close. I never left the SUV again. The next morning was my third day. I had almost accepted that nobody was coming. Then I heard something different. Not footsteps, rotor blades. At first I thought it was another hallucination. Then the sound grew louder. I stumbled into the road and waved both arms. A yellow search and rescue helicopter appeared over the ridge. It circled once, then again. I dropped to my knees. 20 minutes later, a rescue truck reached my location. 2 deputies and a paramedic climbed out. One of them handed me a bottle of water. "Easy," he said. "Small sips." They checked my pulse, my blood pressure, and asked a dozen questions. One deputy looked at my SUV. "You've been alone the whole time?" "Yes." "You sure?" I nodded. He pointed toward the sand. "There are fresh footprints everywhere." "I know. I mean besides yours." The rescue team spread out around the area. One deputy returned a few minutes later. His expression had changed. "We found boot prints leading toward your vehicle." "And?" "They stop about 10 feet away." "What do you mean?" "They don't leave." I frowned. "What?" "They come toward your SUV, then disappear." I didn't answer. I was too tired to think. Back at the ranger station, they told me another driver had reported seeing my abandoned SUV from a distant overlook that morning. That's what started the search. My vehicle was later towed back to Las Vegas. A week after I got home, I downloaded every photo from my cameras. Most were exactly what I remembered. The mining camp, Joshua Trees, the desert road. Then I opened the drone footage from the afternoon before my SUV broke down. The drone had been nearly 400 feet in the air. The camera captured miles of open desert. I paused the video. Behind my SUV, farther down the dirt road, a person was walking, slowly, keeping the exact same distance behind my vehicle, frame after frame. They never got closer. They never fell behind. They simply matched my speed. I watched the footage again. Then I noticed something else. The timestamp showed the video had been recorded almost 40 minutes before my tire blew out. That meant whoever was following me had already been there long before I realized I was stranded. Curious, I zoomed into one of the still images. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to make out one detail. The person was carrying something in their right hand, a clear plastic bottle. Months later, one of the deputies called me after the investigation was officially closed. He said they never identified the footprints. They never found another vehicle in the area. They never found anyone matching my description. Before hanging up, I asked him one question that had been bothering me since my rescue. "What happened to the 2 bottles with the messages?" There was a long pause. Finally, he answered quietly. "Ryan, we never recovered any bottles except the one we gave you after the rescue." I didn't know how to respond. I remembered drinking from them, holding them, reading the messages. I know they were real, but according to the official report, there was no evidence they had ever existed. I still have nightmares about that desert. Not because my SUV broke down, not because I nearly died of dehydration, but because somewhere in the Mojave, someone spent 3 days keeping me alive without ever letting me see their face. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I can still hear slow footsteps circling my bed, waiting for me to leave the road.